John Swinton from the UK, or from Scotland, he would correct me to say, from Scotland, who many of you do not know or may not know that John was for 17 years a psychiatric nurse before he became a pastor, and later a PhD in pastoral theology. I think many people see his writing and his voice as some of the best work in pastoral theology around in a number of different arenas. Last year you heard him do his brief talk on a theology of autism, and he's been doing work in the last couple of years, writing and research around theology and dementia and Alzheimer's, and that's what he's going to focus on this morning. So from Scotland and Aberdeen, sir, we welcome you.
Good morning. That's fine, thank you. Before I begin my presentation this morning, I need to begin with an apology. I have a Scottish accent, and you guys don't, and I'm really, really sorry about that. I think it's something to do with the fall and the Tower of Babel, I'm not sure, but either way, once you are redeemed, you'll be able to speak properly. This morning I want us to talk about a little aspect of dementia. I mean, dementia is a huge issue, and that whole question of who are you when you've forgotten who you are, who are you before God when you've forgotten who God is, it raises huge theological questions and issues. And so in a kind of half-hour talk, it's going to be tricky to tie something down, but I want to focus in on one particular dimension, and that's that whole question of do you remain yourself when you experience dementia? Or does dementia somehow take away from you that which is essential to yourself? And that's the question I want us to think about and to wrestle with this morning. And before I talk to you, I wanted to turn to the person beside you and tell them who you are. Okay, I need to bring you back again. Now you've revealed your identity. Right. As well as getting to know each other a little bit better, you can fill people in fully at lunchtime as to who you actually are. If in fact you know who you are, which is another set of questions. But I bet you when you were trying to describe who you were, to give something of your personal identity, you would give somebody your name. You probably say where it was you came from. You may say what's your interest in disability, or you may ask what their professional life actually comprises of. Now, my question to you is, how do you describe yourself when you've forgotten who you are? When none of these things are now available to you, who are you? And that's a fundamentally important question. Do you cease to be because you no longer remember who you are? Or is there another dimension to who you are that's profoundly important? This is my friend Peter, and I have permission to talk about him. I have permission to use his picture. Peter is a school teacher. All his life he's been in charge of primary schools in Scotland. He's been a very important role within the educational system. He's the father of two children. He's a stepfather of two children. He's married. And he lives in Aberdeen, and he has Alzheimer's disease. And over the years, it's developed, and it's become more and more difficult for him. At first, he stayed at home with his wife, Aileen, and she did a really good job, and together they lived together for as long as it was possible for them to live together. But after a little while, after several years, he had to be taken into care. And Peter was taken into care, and he now lives with strangers. He lives with people who don't know him, who don't know his history, who don't know where he's been, what his true personhood is. He lives with people who, some of them, who don't share his own language, don't share his own culture. And so he, after living most of his life in this place, he lives his life in a different place. Now, of course, he has friends. Well, he has some friends. Many of his friends have decided to abandon him in the midst of that. But he has friends that keep visiting him. He has a very loyal wife, and he has a good life overall. And I want to think about what Peter's situation means to us. This is what Aileen sent to me in an email. She said, "Dear John, I thought you might like these two quotes." God, I'm going to hurt my neck here, excuse me. Might like these two quotes for your book on dementia. My eyesight's going, I can't see that one there. Like, so you're going to have to bear with me. Like, I'm getting old, I'm getting grey, I'm getting fat, but I'm still beautiful. Right. This is an email she sent me as I was writing my book on dementia. She said this. One of the care workers that was working alongside him, this was before Peter went into care, said, "You should just divorce him." Now, what's the thinking going on there? The thinking is that Peter's not the person that he was before. He now has lost himself, so therefore it's justifiable to divorce him. And you might have noticed some of the recent conversations in the media by, now I've forgotten his name, it's come out of my head. What's that evangelist called? Pat Robertson, thank you. You might have noticed that the interview that was done with him recently on the 77 show, I think it was, where somebody had phoned in and had explained that their wife had Alzheimer's, what should he do? And he was quite comfortable. He said, well, she's not the person that she was before, so you should divorce him. Evangelicals got quite cross with him because obviously, as an evangelical, divorce is not allowable. His argument really underpinning that was, well, technically she's dead anyway, so therefore divorce is probably okay. Either way you want to think about it, that's not an uncommon way of thinking about somebody with Alzheimer's. They're not the person they were. Listen to the language you use. It's okay to do certain things. Alzheimer's, definitely time for a blue pill. Support worker from the local psychiatric hospital said within the context of referring Peter for assessment at the day hospital. What's a blue pill? Euthanasia. So it's better to be dead than to have Alzheimer's. And interesting, when you look at the literature, actually, people say that Alzheimer's is the most feared of illnesses. Cancer, people are afraid of in a different way, but Alzheimer's and dementia, people are deeply fearful of. All the people are very nice and easy to talk to, but surely there's something terribly wrong in all of this, Aileen tells me. And there is something terribly wrong in all of this. Why do we lose the person simply because they've forgotten who they are? So the question I want to wrestle with is, does losing yourself mean that you disappear? Or is there something else, some other way of working with this? Now, what does it mean to be yourself? And you can see that the more I think, the more confused I get. And that's the story of my life. I get paid to think. I get paid to read books, so haha. But what does it mean really to be yourself? And I want to take you through a little framework of the self that might help us to begin to think about that. There's quite a lot of text on this slide, but don't worry about it. You can I'll give the slides to Bill and he can send them to you, because I just want to give you the essence in the time that we've got. Stephen Sabat, who's a really interesting thinker, begins to look at the lived experience of dementia, and he does a series of qualitative research projects or conversations with people who have dementia, some of them who have severe dementia. And he begins out of his thinking to recognize that the self is much more complicated and much more socially constructed than he might otherwise have thought. And he divides the self into three different aspects. Self one exists as long as a person effectively is conscious. As long as you've got a sense of who you are, you may not be able to name who you are, but who you are means that you have a self. So in that sense, the self is inviolable. It's not possible not to have a self. It's possible not to recognize that a person has a self, but people have selves. And one of the interesting things that he noticed, particularly in people with advanced dementia, was that the language they use is deeply meaningful and deeply expressive of the self, even though sometimes they weren't able to use the right words. And so in his interviews, people would use language that didn't relate directly to what they were talking about, but clearly because of the neurological damage, it simply meant that they were using the words with a different meaning. And what he does in these interviews is begin to trace back the use of the wrong words in inverted commas and begin to look at the experience there. So self one is that place where you experience the world as you, even if you can't name the world or you. Self two is all of your physical characteristics. The fact that you're in the world, the fact that your hair is blue, the fact, well, your hair's blue, your eyes are blue. Well, your hair can be blue if you wanted to be blue. I think I'd quite suit blue hair. It's better than this kind of greyish. Actually, I think I look quite distinguished. Thank you. Thank you very much for laughing. So it's your physical characteristics. It's to do with your weight, your eye pigmentation, your beliefs, all of these things that help you to orientate yourself to a particular understanding of who you are in the world. Self three is slightly different because it's the various different social persona that you have. So you take on the persona of a father, of a mother, as a sister, a brother, a teacher, a lecturer, and so on and so forth. Now the key thing about self three is you need other people before you can actually achieve self three. It's impossible to be a valued person if nobody values you. Okay. So self three belongs to community. Self one belongs to you in that sense. Self two has to do with your physical, biological, and some of your social developments. But self three belongs to this room. I can only be a lecturer to you guys if you allow me to be that. So self three sits around there. And of course that gives us a very different understanding of the way that the self works itself out. Within Western culture we tend to think about the self in terms of I think therefore I am, that self is an enclosed thing that lives within our bodies or lives within our minds, lives within our structures. But what Sabat's structure of self suggests is that actually the self lives in many different places. And I am, not because I think, I am because we are, which of course is that kind of African Ubuntu theology way of looking at the world. I am because we are. Any dissolution of the self entails a dissolution of the community. In other words, there's nothing inherent within dementia that takes away your selfness. There may be something deeply flawed within a community that takes away your selfness. And so what Sabat is suggesting is that whilst we want to take the biological dimensions of dementia very seriously, of course it's a deeply troublesome condition, much of the experience of what it means to be you, it means to be me, belongs to our communities. So think about in the context of Peter. Peter's self one is fully intact. He still has a sense of who he is. He still has some memories about his self two as well, but he's certainly aware of his name, even though these things are beginning to slip away. He knows he's a person in the world. But it becomes more complicated when we move to self two. He's still a father, a husband, a teacher, a friend. He's still valuable, but he's got all these new roles that he's accumulating. Alzheimer's victim, a burden of little worth, friendless, no longer spiritual. People don't take him to church anymore. So all of these things don't emerge from the biological condition, they emerge from the way that people perceive Peter as himself. And of course, within that context, self-3 is impossible. It's impossible for him to find a value as a person. It's impossible for him to find friends because nobody will give him that gift, to borrow Hansey's wonderful expression. Nobody will give him that gift, so therefore he can't have that. And so if he is losing his self, if he is losing his personhood, and I want to come back to personhood in a second, then it's not his fault. It's the fault of his community. It's the fault of those around him. And this resonates really strongly with Psalm 88. I am forgotten, cut off from your care. You have thrown me into the lowest pit, into the darkest depths. Your anger weighs me down with wave after wave. You have engulfed me. You've driven my friends away by making me repulsive to them. I'm a trap with no way of escape. My eyes are blinded by my tears. Each day I beg for you, help, O Lord. I lift my hands to you for mercy. Are your wonderful deeds of any use to the dead? Do the dead rise up and praise you? Can those in the grave declare your unfailing love? Can they proclaim your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Can the darkness speak of your wonderful deeds? Can anyone in the land of forgetfulness talk about your righteousness? And so there's a real sense in which Peter's life is a lament. It's not a hopeless lament, but it is a lament that brings to light the true nature, if you like, of the experience of dementia. So the problem for many people with dementia is not that they have forgotten, but that they have been forgotten. I think that's a really important theological principle. It's one that's run through the morning's talks. The problem is not that people forget, it's that they're forgotten. And that all brings that resonance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's poem, Who Am I? And I want to come back to Bonhoeffer in a second because he's got something important to say to this conversation. Bonhoeffer says this in one of his prison poems, Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once a hypocrite before others and before myself a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, feeling in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, God, I am thine. And think about it, what makes you the same person that you were when you were 8 years old? When all of the cells in your body have been changed and transformed into something different? What makes you who you are when you've forgotten most of what's happened in your life? Because human beings are not really creatures that remember, they're creatures that forget. Most of what's happened in your life, you've forgotten. Bonhoeffer says, I have no idea who I am. And he's speaking from his prison experience, where everything that reminded him in a sense of who he was has been taken from him. And he's in his prison cell and he suddenly realizes, I don't know who I am and probably never did know who I am. The only person that knows who I am is God. And that's really, really important. The only person that really knows who you are or who I am is God. And that takes us back to something really important. And that's to do with contingency, and it's to do with creation. One of the things that we learn as we begin to strip back the kind of biomedical story from dementia is that the experience that people with dementia have of forgetting who they are, where they are, forgetting whose they are, is actually revealing of the whole of the human experience. We are contingent creatures who are wholly dependent on God for everything that we have and everything we are and everything that we're liable to do in our lives. One of the interesting things, and we haven't got time to chase it this morning, but one of the interesting things when you look at Scripture is it's a very different picture of the person from the kind of picture that we have within our own culture, within Western culture, where we're always seeking after who we are. If you look at particularly in the Old Testament, God tells you who you are. You don't have any choice. You're told who you are, and you're told what to do. And the very essence of sin is refusing to be who you are and refusing to do what you're told. The idea that somehow we are independent, autonomous beings is something that we've created very late in history. The experience of dementia reminds us that we are creatures, created by God, whose God's breath is breathed into us and who sustains us through no effort of our own and no ability of our own. We are created as creatures. We may have capacities, we may have things that we can do after that, but the bottom line is we're contingent and we are created. When it comes to our personhood, and we can go back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because one of the things that many of us didn't know about Bonhoeffer, was that much of his thinking in defense of the Jews and against the Nazi atrocities came from his time in Bethesda, which was a little village town in Germany, which was really full of people with disabilities. People who were homeless, people who were epileptic, people who had a variety of disabilities. That was the place where Bonhoeffer learned that to be a creature was the essence of to be a human being, that our capacities, our capabilities are deceptive. And he learned in that community, living alongside people with significant disabilities, that personhood and creatureliness were exactly the same thing. It's impossible for us not to be persons, Bonhoeffer says, as long as we recognize that we are creatures. And one of the interesting things he noticed, particularly living alongside people with epilepsy, was how fragile our notion of health and illness was, because the way he frames it is that 1 minute a person with epilepsy is well, next minute they're not well, next minute they're well. And he uses that as a way of kind of exploring the fragility and the flexibility of our understanding of what health is. So, to be a creature is to be a person. So does dementia destroy personhood? We are creatures for whom decay is inevitable. Personhood is not diminished by dementia or any other condition. Such conditions are part of what it means to be a human creature. We do not move from being persons to being non-persons. Change and decay in all of its forms is part of what it means to be a person. And dementia may be a very sharp reminder of that, but it is that. It's a sharp reminder of something beyond ourselves. So our memories don't make us who we are. We are whom God remembers us to be. And that's the conversation maybe we can have this afternoon. What does it mean to be remembered by God? What does it mean to be told who you are? So dementia reminds us of whose we are and what it means to be a creature. And finally, to be a disciple is to remember others well. Because to be a disciple is to recognize that you live within creation. To recognize that you live within creation recognizes that there is a movement of redemption within creation that you're a part of. And part of that movement of redemption, that the Apostle Paul says that creation is groaning for redemption. Part of that movement has to do with remembering well. Remembering one another well and remembering the place that we live well. So to finish, to be human is to be remembered well. And so devastating and terrible as dementia may be, if we move from a medical perspective into a theological perspective, A, there is hope and new possibilities, and B, there is revelation as we recognize both whose we are and where we live. Thank you. Bill said that was rubbish. He said, get right back up there and do it again, properly this time. All right, Bill.
So we can understand it.
Well, I will try. Is that? Bill wants me to tell the story, and it's actually a useful story just to illustrate the essence of the point that I'm trying to make to you. And it's a story that was given to me by my friend and colleague, Margaret Hutchison, who at that time lived in Adelaide. She was a nurse who worked in a dementia ward. It was a dementia ward in these days, that's exactly what it was called. And it was a story about a woman with dementia who was a very pleasant woman who was described as being in the mid-stages of dementia, although I'm not convinced about stages of anything. Normally she was a very placid and pleasant person, but suddenly for whatever reason she became anxious, she became troubled, and sometimes she even became a little bit aggressive, and she would walk up and down the corridor of the ward in which she was in, and she would repeat the same word again and again and again and again and again. Now the team got together and they began to think, well, how do we respond to this? Should we medicate her? Should we restrain her? What should we do? And one nurse who was a Christian got alongside this woman and began to listen to her. And as she listened to her, the word that she was repeating again and again and again was the word God. She's walking up and down the corridor going, God, 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 God. And the nurse suddenly managed to have a spiritual reframe of the situation. She suddenly saw what was happening. And she said to the woman, are you afraid that you're going to forget God? And the woman stopped in her tracks and looked her in the eye and said, yes, that's it. I'm afraid I'm going to forget God. All her life she had been a Christian. All her life her faith had been the essence of the way that she saw the world and perceived her experiences within that. And she was terrified that she'd forget God. And the nurse said to her, you will forget God, but God will never forget you. And immediately she calmed down, and that behaviour didn't happen again. And so she didn't need medication, she didn't need restraining, she needed spiritual care.